The man who told her she would die did not raise his voice. He did not gesture toward the sky or invoke the names of men who had frozen in their beds. He simply looked at Maren Voss with the flat patience of someone who has watched water find its level many times and knows the outcome before the pour begins. August Strand had survived 16 winters in Carleton County, Minnesota, and he had seen the particular expression on her face before, the one that sits just behind the eyes and looks like courage, but is really just the refusal to understand what is coming. A woman alone cannot cut enough timber. He said, his vowels shaped by decades of talking to men who listened. You will freeze, and those children will freeze with you. He was not trying to wound her. That was the part she would remember long after the cold had made her a different person entirely. He was simply stating the arithmetic of survival as he understood it and in his understanding. The numbers did not add up in her favor. 3 months earlier, Maren had never lifted anything heavier than a slate board eraser in a Carbondale classroom. She had chalked long division on a blackboard, while 22 children copied the numbers into notebooks, and she had believed with the mild confidence of someone who has never been seriously wrong that she understood how problems worked. You identified the unknown. You gathered what was given. You solved. The frontier, she would discover, was a problem that ate the given and handed you back nothing but the unknown. She arrived at the St. Louis River on the 15th of September, 1887, with Ada pressed against her left side and Eli asleep against her right shoulder, in a canvas sack containing everything they owned, resting against her ankles on the floor of a hired wagon. The driver had not spoken to her since Duluth except to ask once whether she was certain of the address, and she had said yes with a certainty she did not fully possess. When the wagon stopped beside a wooden stake driven into wet earth at the corner of a quarter section of land that had belonged to her husband until 3 weeks prior, the driver did not help with the bags. He set them on the grass beside the stake and climbed back to his seat and gave the horse a sound that was not quite a word, and the wagon moved away down a rutted track, and within 4 minutes it was gone from sight, and Maren stood in the rain with her children and looked at what Walter Voss had left her. What Walter had left her was technically land. 160 acres of Carleton County, Minnesota, deeded into her name on the 24th of August with a signature that looked more careful than any signature he had ever produced in their 5 years of marriage, as though he had understood in that moment at the county office that this was a document that would outlast his intentions. He had left one other thing, a folded piece of paper tucked into the breast pocket of the coat he had placed over the back of her chair before he walked out. She had read it in the kitchen of their rented house in Carbondale, with Ada sitting at the table eating apple slice and Eli on the floor pushing a wooden spool across the boards. It said, "The land is yours. I am not the man who deserves to work it." The writing was even and unhurried, which meant he had written it more than once before he got to the version she held. She had folded it back along its original creases and put it in the bottom of the canvas sack beneath the extra stockings, and she had not taken it out since, but she knew it was there, the way she knew her own pulse, a fact she didn't have to verify to understand was true. The quarter section stretched away from the stake in every direction with the indifference of land that has been waiting for one owner or another for longer than anyone in the territory could remember. Scrubby timber ran along the river to the south, mostly birch and pine, with the occasional elm that looked like it had wandered in from somewhere more temperate and never found its way back. To the north, the ground rose toward a ridge that caught the last of the evening light in a way that might have seemed beautiful under different circumstances. To the east, there was nothing visible at all through the rain. To the west, the same. She was 4 miles from the nearest settlement, which was a town called Thompson, and which contained, as she would discover the next morning, a general store, a blacksmith, a sawmill that had burned and not been rebuilt, and a small collection of houses arranged along either side of a railroad track as if they were waiting for a train that was perpetually late. Ada asked when Papa was coming back. Maren told her daughter that she didn't know which was the first completely honest thing she had said to either of her children in several weeks. She had been saying things like soon, and he had some business to attend to, and you know how Papa gets when there's something important to handle. And all of those things had been versions of a story she was constructing in real time to cover the shape of something she did not yet have language for. She did not have language for a husband who looked at his family and saw not the thing he was responsible for, but the proof of every dream he hadn't managed to make real. She did not have language for the specific loneliness of a man who loves the idea of a life more than the life itself. She would find that language eventually. That night in the rain, watching her daughter's face work through the calculation of an answer that didn't satisfy. She only knew that she was standing in a field 4 miles from anywhere with $7.40 in the pocket of a wool coat that was soaking through. They slept under the wagon canvas she had folded into a tent between two birch saplings, and Maren did not sleep at all. She lay with a child against each side of her and listened to the rain on the canvas and calculated. Lumber cost $20 for 1,000 board feet, and she needed at least twice that to frame anything that would keep the cold out. A cast iron stove cost $30 minimum, and that was if you found someone selling used. Glass for windows was $1.50 per pane, and she would need at minimum 6 panes. Nails by the keg cost $2, and she would need 2 kegs, at least probably 3. A proper spade cost $2. A mattock for breaking through root-bound soil cost $3. A pickaxe for the clay layer she could see was going to be the problem cost $4. She kept adding, and the numbers kept not adding up, and at some point the rain stopped and the clouds broke, and she could see stars through the birch leaves above her, cold and very far away. And she was still awake when the sky began to lighten in the east, and Ada stirred against her shoulder and asked if it was time to get up. She taught school in Carbondale for 6 years from the age of 22 until she married Walter at 28. And the thing about teaching that no one tells you before you start is that it requires you to hold the shape of a solution even when you cannot yet see the solution itself. You have to project confidence in the existence of an answer so that the children trust that the process of looking for it is worth their time. Maren had gotten good at this. She had gotten so good at it that she sometimes had convinced herself, which was perhaps why she was standing in a field in Minnesota in September instead of in a kitchen in Illinois. She had convinced herself that Walter's descriptions of the land-rich soil timber for building a community of settlers who would help each other through the hard times were the shape of a solution rather than the opening moves of another promise that would turn to weather. She walked to Thompson the next morning, carrying Eli and holding Ada's hand, and the mud from the previous night's rain pulled at her boots with every step. The town resolved itself out of the morning mist in pieces, first the water tower, then the roof line of the general store, then the railroad track shining dull silver in the low light. Behind the store, 4 men stood around a wagon loaded with cordwood and argued about the price of split oak versus unsplit, and one of them was August Strand. She would not know his name for another 20 minutes, but she noted him immediately because he was the kind of man who occupies space differently than the men around him. Not louder, not larger, but somehow more settled, as though he had made a permanent agreement with the ground beneath his feet. The storekeeper's name was Gus Pelham, and he had the particular wariness of a man who had extended credit to too many people who had subsequently found Minnesota winter to be more than they had bargained for. He looked at Maren's children and then at her dress, which was still carrying the mud of the previous evening, in its hem, and then at her eyes, which were carrying something he recognized but could not have named easily. He called Strand over. What happened next would come to feel in retrospect like the moment a season changes, not the day it happens, which is always ambiguous, but the moment you understand that it has happened and there is no reversing it. Strand listened to Maren explain her situation with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on a point somewhere past her left ear, the way a man listens when he is not deciding whether he believes you, but whether the information changes anything about what he already knows. She told him about the quarter section. She told him about the stake in the ground and the canvas tent and the $7 and the children. She did not tell him about Walter's note because it was hers and she was not yet in the habit of giving away things that were hers. When she finished, Strand was quiet for long enough that Eli, bored, sat down in the dirt at her feet and began moving pebbles from one pile to another. Strand watched the boy for a moment and then said what he said, and the words landed in the air between them with the specific weight of something true being spoken by someone who does not take particular pleasure in the speaking. A woman alone cannot cut enough timber. You will need 8 cords minimum for a cabin that size and another 10 cords for fuel through winter. You cannot fell trees with children underfoot. You cannot notch logs without a partner to lift them. And even if you could, you have no team to drag the timber, no saw to mill the boards, no money to buy what you cannot make. He looked at her steadily. You will freeze, and those children will freeze with you. Maren felt something move through her chest that she initially mistook for fear. She would understand later that it was anger, which is fear's more useful sibling. Strand was not wrong about the numbers. He was not trying to harm her. He was doing her the courtesy of accuracy, which was, she understood, a form of respect that some people wear as cruelty without meaning to. But she also knew what came after accuracy if you let it have the last word, and so she said, then what should I do? Strand told her to go back to Duluth, find work as a domestic, give up the claim. There was no shame in it, he said. The shame was in staying until the cold took you. He said this with the same evenness he had used for everything else, which meant he believed it the same way he believed everything else, which meant he believed it completely. She looked at Eli moving his pebbles in the dirt. She looked at Ada, who had stopped watching the men and was now watching her mother with an expression that was very old for a 6-year-old face. Maren said, I won't give up my land. And Strand studied her for a moment and then nodded once slowly, the way you nod when you understand that the conversation has ended, not because it has concluded, but because the other person has made a decision that closes the door on further reasoning. He turned and went back to the argument about cordwood, and Gus Pelham looked at Maren with an expression that she would spend the next 3 months proving wrong, and she bought a sack of oats with 60 cents of her money and carried Eli 4 miles back to the stake in the ground. What she had told Strand in the general store that morning, the part about the claim, the part about not giving it up, she repeated to herself that night under the canvas, as though repetition would thicken it into something structural. She said it the way she used to say multiplication tables to children who needed to hear the answer become familiar before it became automatic. She was 34 years old. She had been a school teacher for 6 years and a wife for 5 and a mother for 6, and she had lived the whole of her life in a country where the basic fact of her competence was always slightly in question, slightly subject to verification by someone whose verification was considered more reliable than her own. Walter had done this in small ways that she had mostly forgiven him for the way he rephrased her suggestions when he repeated them to other people, as though they needed translation to be understood. She had understood marrying him, that this was the shape of the world she was moving through. It had not seemed worth refusing the world over. But she was done translating herself. The land was in her name. The stake was in the ground. She was going to find a way to stay on it if she had to move the entire river to do it. She spent the first 3 weeks on the claim trying to dig a dugout into the south-facing hillside near the river. The homesteading pamphlet Walter had left behind in Carbondale described the process in a way that was technically accurate and practically useless, the way many descriptions of difficult things are. It told you what the result should look like without telling you what the ground actually felt like when you drove a flat rock into it for the 6th hour in a row. The first foot of soil came up without too much resistance. Below that, the earth was a different substance, entirely dense with roots and packed with the particular stubbornness of ground that has not been disturbed for a very long time and has come to consider its current arrangement permanent. She worked with whatever she had, flat rocks for scraping, her hands for carrying, her apron for moving loose dirt away from the hole. At the end of the first week, she had a hollow in the hillside, roughly 6 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and 3 feet high, barely large enough for the children to sit in. At the end of the second week, it was slightly larger, and her hands were so blistered that Ada cried when she looked at them, which Maren could not afford to find moving, and so she did not. She ate 1 meal a day and gave the rest to the children. She slept fewer hours than her body was asking for and told herself it was temporary, which it was, though not in the way she meant. On the last Saturday of September, she spent $2 on a real spade. The man at Pelham's general store had to order it from Duluth, and it arrived 4 days later. And on the morning of the second day, she used it, the handle snapped clean, where the wood met the iron collar, and she sat in the half-dug hillside with the broken piece in her hand and the children playing 20 feet away, and she cried. It was not a long cry. She had spent 6 years teaching children that the feeling of not knowing the answer was the necessary beginning of finding the answer. And she believed this, but she also knew that the person who has to find the answer and the person who has to hold themselves together while finding the answer are sometimes two different people occupying the same exhausted body, and for about 4 minutes, those two people inside her were having a very difficult conversation. Then Eli called out something about a frog he had found near the water. And Ada said he shouldn't pick it up. And the argument between them was so normal and so entirely unrelated to broken spades and frozen hillsides that Maren laughed, which was worse than crying for a moment, and then abruptly, better. She stood up and went to see the frog. By the 1st of October, she had understood several things that the pamphlet had not told her. She understood that she could not dig the dugout to completion before the ground froze, which was going to happen in a matter of weeks. She understood that even if she could, she had no way to get logs for the front wall and no way to haul the poles she would need for the roof. She understood that the numbers Strand had given her in the general store were correct not as a judgment, but as a description of a reality that was indifferent to whether she accepted it. And she understood that accepting reality and accepting defeat were two different operations, and she had only signed up for the first one. She made lists by firelight at night, what she needed, what she had, what the gap between them was. The list of needs grew longer each night, and the list of haves stayed stubbornly short, and the gap widened in ways she tried not to calculate too precisely because precision was not useful, when what it revealed was a size of problem that could not be solved by the means available to her. She needed a different problem, or a different set of means, or both. The frost came on the 3rd of October, arriving without announcement, the way temperatures in Minnesota announced themselves not gradually but all at once, as though the season had simply decided. Maren woke before dawn to find ice crystals on the canvas above her, and both children curled into tight shapes under the wool blankets, their breathing shallow and quick, the way sleeping children breathe when they are colder than they should be. She rebuilt the fire with hands that shook from cold rather than illness, though the distinction was beginning to feel academic. She watched the frost melt off the grass as the sun came up and understood, with a clarity that required no calculation at all, that 11 hours was not a theoretical number. It was the number of hours in a cold October night, and it would be longer in November and longer still in December. And by January, the nights in Carlton County ran to 14 hours, and sometimes the temperature did not come up meaningfully even during the day. She was not going to finish the dugout. She had known this for a week, but had not let herself say it plainly because saying things plainly gives them a solidity that makes them harder to work around. Now she said it to herself inside her own head, in the same voice she used when she explained something to a student who needed to hear a hard thing without drama. You are not going to finish the dugout, Maren. You need something else. Now figure out what that is. She had no answer when she walked to the river to wash clothes on the morning of the 6th of October. She was thinking about the problem, the way she thought about problems she brought home from school, holding the shape of it without forcing it, letting it sit in the background of her attention, while the foreground handled the practical things that needed handling. The river had widened into a series of ledges, here the water running shallow and quick over exposed stone, and the stone was unusual. Not the rounded glacial boulders she had grown up around in Illinois. Flat slabs, dark gray, stacked like the pages of a book left open on a table with smooth faces and sharp edges, where pieces had separated along lines so straight they looked intentional. Eli was stacking them on the bank. He had been at it all morning collecting flat rocks and building towers that fell, and building them again, his face carrying the particular concentration of a child who has found a task that matches something internal and satisfying in himself. Maren watched him place one slab on top of another, then another 4, 5, 6, 7. The tower wobbled but held. He turned to look at her with the expression of someone who has done something worth seeing. Look, Mama, it's a house. She dried her hands on her apron and walked up the bank. The stones were dark gray, almost black, with a faint sheen that caught the morning light in a way that was almost metallic. She crouched beside Eli's tower and picked up one of the pieces and felt its weight. Dense, but not impossible. 10 or 12 pounds for a piece the size of a dinner plate about an inch thick. The faces were nearly smooth. The edges broke in straight lines, not crumbles. She turned the piece in her hands, and something moved in her memory. Not a thought exactly, more like the edge of a thought, the shape of something half-remembered that she had not known she retained. She had been 12 years old when her father took her on a 2-day trip to Vermont to source roofing material from a quarry near the Connecticut River. The quarrymen had let her watch while they split the stone along its natural planes, showing her how you found the line and followed it with a mallet and chisel, how the rock opened along those planes as cleanly as a book opens along its spine. The smell of the stone dust was sharp and dry. The slabs had been thin enough to write on and strong enough to hold a man's weight. The quarry foreman had told her father that the stone had been forming since before there were fish in the sea, which she had not quite believed and had never forgotten. This rock looked exactly like that rock. Dark, fine-grained, layered along parallel planes, the surfaces almost glassy, where they had been exposed by the river. She pressed her thumbnail against the face of the slab she was holding and felt no give, no crumble. She stood and looked upstream, where the ledges continued as far as she could see, tilted at a shallow angle out of the riverbed like the spines of enormous buried books. There were hundreds of them, thousands, an inexhaustible supply of flat stackable stone already broken by the river into pieces she could lift lying along the banks and scattered across the shallows as though they had been waiting for someone to understand what they were. She set Eli's slab back down on top of his tower very carefully so the structure didn't fall. She stood at the water's edge for a long moment. She was thinking about a book she had borrowed from the school library in Carbondale, A History of Early Settlement in the American Northeast, with an engraving of a stone shelter built by settlers in western Massachusetts in the 1600s. The shelter was a low, A-shaped structure, walls leaning inward against each other, the whole thing looking more like a tent made of rock than anything you would call a building. The caption said the structure had sheltered 4 people through a winter when the timber supply had failed. She had looked at the engraving for a long time and then moved on to the next chapter, which was about something else entirely. She had nothing else. She had this. She carried the first stone to dry ground above the flood line and set it down. Then she went back for another, and then another. She carried stones until the sun had moved well past noon, and her back was sending signals she was choosing to ignore, and when she stopped and looked at what she had assembled, 200 flat slabs sorted roughly by size, the largest at the bottom of the pile and the smallest on top, all of them dark gray against the autumn grass. She felt something she had not felt since September. Not hope exactly. Hope was too light a word for what she needed and too easily broken. What she felt was the beginning of a plan which is heavier than hope and built closer to the ground and considerably harder to collapse. She did not know yet whether the plan would work. She did not know whether Slate could hold heat or whether flat stones could form walls that would stand against wind, or whether a woman who had never built anything more substantial than a leaky chicken coop in Illinois could construct something that would keep 2 children alive through a Minnesota winter. But she had noticed in 6 years of teaching that the moment you locate the material, the moment you find the thing you can actually work with, is the moment the problem changes shape. It does not become smaller. It becomes specific. And specific problems, unlike general ones, have edges you can push against. She began the experiment the following morning. She stacked a small wall 3 courses high, about 4 feet long, using the largest slab she had carried from the river. It collapsed twice. The second time it fell, she sat in the dirt beside it and looked at the individual pieces and tried to understand what the failure was telling her. The stones were not the problem. The angle was the problem. A vertical wall wanted to tip because there was nothing leaning against it from the other side. But if she leaned 2 walls against each other, each one propping the other, the angle transferred the weight downward instead of outward, and the whole structure became self-supporting. She tried this and the walls held. She pushed against them with both hands, first gently, and then with her full weight, and they did not move. She discovered that large stones needed to overlap smaller ones at the joints, bridging the gap, so there was no continuous line of weakness running from top to bottom. She discovered that small stones wedged into cracks stopped larger stones from shifting sideways under their own weight. She was working out by feel and failure, a grammar of stone that people who built with stone had been developing for thousands of years, and she was working it out alone in a field in Minnesota in October, because she had no other option and no one to ask. 4 days into the experiment, Burger Holm appeared on the trail above her claim. He was perhaps 40, with a beard trimmed to a precise length that suggested a man who maintained himself carefully even when no one was likely to notice. He had a farm 3 miles to the north near the Thompson Road, and his wife Ingrid had heard about the woman at the river and had pressed Burger to go see what was happening because Ingrid had a practical curiosity about the world that her husband had learned to take seriously over 15 years of marriage. He found Maren on her knees beside a stone wall that was already 2 courses high and 8 feet long and showing unmistakably the inward lean of something that intended to hold itself up. "What is this?" The words were not unfriendly. They were the words of a man who is looking at something that does not match any category he has available. Maren stood and wiped stone dust from her palms. "A shelter," she told him. "For winter." She described her intention, the A-frame shape, the walls meeting at a ridgeline, no need for mortar, because the angle would do the work that mortar did in vertical construction. Holm walked around the foundation, pausing to test the stability of each course, pressing on the stones the way a carpenter checks a joint. He was not dismissing her. He was trying to understand whether what he was looking at could possibly function, and his trying was a form of respect, even when it came out sounding like doubt. He said what he said about stone being cold material, and here he was careful, she noticed, to specify the stone he knew from New Hampshire, the granite his father had quarried for cellar foundations, which absorbed heat and gave nothing back, and left a room colder by virtue of existing in it than the room would have been with only air. He told her that in his experience, living inside stone in winter was an invitation to the kind of cold that comes from within rather than without, a cold that settles into the body at the bone level and does not leave until spring. Maren heard him out. Then she pointed to the river and said, "That is not granite, that is slate. The structure is different. The way it handles heat is different." Holmes stopped. He looked at the exposed ledges along the bank, the dark slabs tilted up out of the water. He looked back at Maren. He was a man who knew a great deal about a great many practical things, and he was honest enough to recognize when he was standing at the edge of what he knew. He had no data on slate. He had assumptions about stone in general, and assumptions were not the same as knowledge, and he was too careful a person to confuse the two if he could help it. He made one more argument: the smoke, the ventilation, the danger of carbon dioxide in a sealed stone space, and Maren showed him the gap she was planning at the apex of the A-frame, narrow enough to hold heat wide enough for smoke to draft upward along the rising warm air. He studied this for a while. Then he said how long to build it. She told him 2 to 3 weeks at 40 stones a day. He shook his head slowly, not in negation, but in the way a person shakes their head when they're running the numbers and they don't like what the numbers say. Then he said something that was not warm and was not comforting and was in its own way exactly what she needed. "Build fast. Don't make me come back here to nail shut a box." He turned and walked back toward his farm without waiting for a response. Maren watched him go. She picked up the next stone from the pile. She developed over the following 2 weeks a physical relationship with labor that was unlike anything in her previous experience. Teaching was labor, the sustained attention, the emotional management, the constant calibration of how much a person can learn and how fast, but it did not leave marks on the body the way this did. The blisters on her palms hardened and split and hardened again. Her shoulders, which had never been asked to move more weight than a stack of primers, began aching in a way that was no longer distinguishable from her resting state. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. She slept between 4 and 5 hours a night, which was not enough, and she knew it was not enough, and she continued anyway because the alternative to not enough sleep was not enough shelter. And of those two insufficiencies, she had decided which one she could survive. She carried stones from the river every afternoon and built every morning while the light was good. She learned to read the stone, which pieces would lay flat and which had a curve she hadn't noticed until she tried to stack them. She learned to fill the gaps with river mud, mixed with dead grass, packing the paste into every seam with her fingers until the wall section was close to airtight. She learned that the satisfying thud of a well-placed stone, the sound it made when it settled into exactly the right position, was reliable information, not just sensation. Stones that didn't thud needed to be repositioned before they shifted on their own later. In the 3rd week of October, Edmund Hale rode up the track to her claim on a roan horse and introduced himself as a representative of the Northern Pacific Railway Land Office. He was perhaps 45, with the groomed certainty of a man whose salary did not depend on the weather. He did not dismount. He looked at the structure rising from the ridge, the walls now chest-high, the A-frame geometry clearly visible, and he looked at Maren and he said in a tone of careful pleasantness, "Mrs. Voss, I've been asked to make sure you have everything you need to make a go of this claim. The Northern Pacific takes a real interest in the success of our neighboring settlers. He smiled. He looked at the stone walls. He got out a small notebook and wrote something in it. He said, "Unusual approach to construction. I'll be following your progress with interest." He tipped his hat and rode away, and Maren stood watching the horse until it disappeared around the bend in the track. And she felt the back of her neck prickle in a way that had nothing to do with cold. He had not threatened her. He had not needed to. There was a particular kind of power that expressed itself as attentiveness, and Hale had it, and he had just demonstrated it, and she understood that his interest in her progress was not the kind of interest that wished her well. She went back to laying stone. By the 20th of October, she had carried by her rough count 420 stones from the riverbank to the ridge. The walls of the A-frame were 4 feet high at the peak, 2 feet at the base where they met the ground, and the enclosed space was beginning to feel like something. A dark triangle when she stood inside it, 8 feet long, 5 feet wide at the floor, narrowing to nothing where the walls would eventually meet. She had lined the floor with flat slabs as well, creating a surface that would not turn to mud when their boots brought snow inside. She had planned the fire pit in the center, a shallow depression bordered by the largest slab she had set aside specifically for this purpose, positioned it so the flames would rise toward the smoke gap at the apex, while the heat spread radially outward into the surrounding walls. She did not know in any technical sense why she believed this would work. She could not have described thermal mass, or specific heat capacity, or the difference between conduction and radiation. What she had was the memory of her father's Vermont fireplace, a massive thing built of the same dark stone she was working with now, which held its warmth for hours after the last log had burned down, so that you could come downstairs in the morning to a room that was not warm, but was not dead either, that still held somewhere in its stones the ghost of the previous evening's fire. Her father had said once, banking the coals before bed, the stone remembers. He had meant it simply as observation rather than metaphor, but it had lodged in her the way simple, true things do. And now in October in Minnesota, with winter coming like a door being shut from the outside, she was betting that the stone remembered. She worked. She needed it to be enough. The wall fell on the morning of the 23rd of October, and it was the most instructive thing that had happened to Maren since she arrived in Carlton County. She had built the eastern face of the A-frame to a height of 5 feet over 3 days, working carefully, checking the angle of the lean with the plumb line she had improvised from a length of twine and a stone the weight of a fist. She had believed the wall was sound. She had pressed on it from the outside and felt the resistance she associated with stability, the way a well-made thing pushes back against you. Then at 7 in the morning, while Ada was feeding the fire and Eli was still asleep, Maren set a 40-pound capstone into position, and the entire structure shifted 1 inch to the left and came apart from the middle downward in a sound like an argument that had been building for a long time. 63 stones hit the frost-hard ground, and the noise sent Ada scrambling to her feet and brought Eli out of sleep, sitting upright with his eyes wide and his mouth already open. Nobody was hurt. The children were 10 feet away, and the stones fell inward, which was the direction the physics of the collapse preferred. Maren stood in the wreckage and looked at it for a long time without moving. Then she crouched and began to examine the point of failure the way she used to examine a student's arithmetic error, not to assign fault, but to find the specific place where the reasoning had broken down. What she found was this: the wall had no continuous line of weakness running horizontally through it, which was what she had tried to prevent, but it had a different problem she had not anticipated. The interior stones, the ones pressed against the face of the wall from the inside, had been doing the work of keeping everything locked together, and she had not packed them tightly enough against the facing stones, and so when the capstone added its weight to the column, the whole assembly had enough play in it to begin a movement that once started could not be stopped. She understood the fix immediately. It was not a construction fix. It was a packing fix. The small stones she had been treating as filler, the pieces too irregular to lay flat, the fragments that weren't worth carrying from the river because they seemed incidental. Those were not filler. They were the mechanism, wedged into the gaps between the larger stones with enough force to eliminate all play. They transferred load in multiple directions simultaneously, which meant the wall behaved less like a stack of plates and more like a single compressed object. She spent the rest of that morning relaying every course she had built, this time packing the interstitial spaces with pieces she had previously set aside. And when she pressed on the rebuilt wall at noon, it had a solidity that felt qualitatively different from anything she had built before. Not harder exactly, more resolved, like a decision that has been thought all the way through. Ada watched her work with the observational intensity that had always been her daughter's dominant mode of engagement with the world. At 6, Ada processed experience by studying it, watching a thing happen multiple times before attempting it herself, cataloging variations, noting what changed between attempts. She had done this with reading sitting beside Maren through an entire school term before she started sounding out words on her own, and when she did start, she was immediately competent in a way that children who had learned by trial and error were not. Now she watched her mother lay stone, and then without being asked began bringing pieces from the sorted pile to the wall, selecting them by a method that looked random but produced with suspicious consistency the exact sizes Maren needed next. Neither of them mentioned this. It was simply how they worked together quietly and without ceremony, which was also how they had managed most things in the months since Walter left. The temperature on the 27th of October fell to 12 degrees above zero at night and did not climb above 30 during the day. The mud Maren was using for chinking froze before she could work it into the cracks, which meant she had to heat small batches of it near the fire and apply it quickly and in sections small enough to seal before it stiffened. This added an hour to each working day and required her to tend a second fire during construction hours, which depleted the woodpile faster than she had planned. She had perhaps a cord and a half of wood gathered from deadfall and scrub pine along the river, not nearly enough for a full winter, but enough to get through November if she was careful. She was trying to be careful about everything simultaneously, which was not a sustainable state, but was the only state available. The fever arrived on the 3rd of November, entering without announcement, the way fevers do. She went to sleep cold and woke at 2 in the morning, burning her skin tight across her forehead and her joints moving with the grinding reluctance of machinery that needs oil. She lay still for a while and assessed. Not her lungs. Her chest was clear. The fever was a response, her body spending resources she had forced it to accumulate on credit for too long, the bill arriving with the indifference of all bills. She could not afford to stop working. She also could not work at the pace she had been working, not while her body was engaged in this other project of fighting something she could not see. For 3 days, she built at half speed, setting perhaps 20 stones a day instead of 40, stopping when her vision went unreliable, and sitting with her back against the southern wall of the structure and drinking water she heated near the fire. Ada made oatmeal in the mornings without being asked, portioning it with a seriousness that looked borrowed from an older face, making sure Eli ate before she ate, and that there was something left for Maren, who had been telling herself she wasn't hungry in a way that had started as strategy and was becoming habit. On the second day of the fever, Maren looked at her daughter standing at the fire with a wooden spoon and understood something she had been half aware of for weeks. Ada was not a child waiting to be protected. She was a person learning at speed what the situation required of her. The situation was requiring too much. Maren knew this and could not change it. And the knowledge sat in her chest alongside the fever like a second heat that burned at a different depth. By the 6th of November, the fever had passed and the structure was 6 feet high at the peak. She had perhaps 600 stones still to lay. The smoke gap at the apex was taking shape, a narrow slot she had engineered by leaving specific pieces out of the final courses and reinforcing the edges of the opening with the thickest slabs she had laid perpendicular to the wall face to create a small internal chimney effect. She had tested the draft with a handful of dry grass. In a match, the smoke pulled upward cleanly, which told her the gap was the right width and the interior geometry was doing what geometry does when you get the angles correct. It channeled, it directed, it made use of the invisible pressure gradients that move through enclosed spaces when heat is applied. Ruth Calloway arrived on the 9th of November, and she brought with her a canvas sack containing a 5-pound bag of flour, a jar of lard with the lid sealed in wax, and a smoked ham hock that must have weighed 2 pounds at least. She was a woman of 55 or so, with gray coming through her dark hair, in a pattern that looked less like aging than like a natural continuation of the color underneath. And she had the posture of someone who had learned early that offering help too openly invited either rejection or dependence, and so had developed an elaborate system of presenting assistance as mutual arrangement. She explained that she needed someone to watch her geese while she traveled to Duluth for the birth of her sister's fourth child a week, possibly 10 days beginning on the 15th of December. In exchange for this service, which she characterized as essential, Ruth was prepared to offer the use of her house in Thompson, including the stove and the pantry and the beds. The geese lived 30 feet from the back door. It would be no trouble at all. Maren looked at the food in the sack and then at Ruth's face and understood the transaction precisely. Ruth did not need someone to watch geese. Geese watch themselves with the territorial competence of animals that have never been successfully domesticated and know it. What Ruth was offering was a way for Maren to accept help without accepting charity, because charity in this country and at this time meant something that would follow a person around for years and color every subsequent interaction with the people who had witnessed the receiving of it. The fiction of the geese gave both women a story they could tell that ended with the word trade rather than the word pity, and Maren was grateful for the fiction, even as she recognized it for what it was. Before she left, Ruth reached into her coat pocket and set a small notebook on the stone pile nearest the door opening. It had a brown paper cover, and the pages were dense with handwriting in a hand that was small and very precise. Maren opened it after Ruth had gone. Inside was a list of 11 families in Carleton County, with notes beside each name, who had put up extra corn this year, who had a milk cow that had come through the summer with twin calves, who owed 3 days of labor to the Hendersons from the spring planting, who had a husband laid up with a back injury, and 3 children and not enough wood split for December. The notes were current, they were specific, they were the kind of information that requires sustained and careful attention to accumulate, which meant Ruth had been paying that attention for a long time, which meant this network had been operating quietly and without acknowledgement for longer than any of its participants were likely to announce. Maren held the notebook and understood that she had been thinking about her isolation in a way that was not entirely accurate. She was not alone in the way August Strand had meant when he said she was alone. She was alone in the way a person is alone who has not yet learned to read the particular language being spoken around her. She put the notebook in the bottom of the canvas sack next to Walter's note. Edmund Hale returned on the 21st of November, and this time he did not come alone. The man he brought introduced himself as a representative of the Territorial Health Authority, a thin person in a coat too light for the weather, who held a leather satchel and wore the specific expression of someone doing a job they find distasteful but financially necessary. Hale had been constructive about his grievances. He had found a technical frame for the thing he wanted, which was for Maren to leave the claim and not come back. The technical frame this time was medical. The representative said that a child in the vicinity had been reported to be experiencing respiratory symptoms, and given the nature of the construction, stone heated by combustion, there was a concern about particulate matter and gaseous emissions from the heated slate. He said the word gaseous with the care of a man using a word he had been given rather than one he owned. There was a protocol, he said, for structures presenting potential health hazards to occupants. The protocol involved an inspection. The inspection needed to happen within 5 days, or the structure would be subject to a vacate order pending review. Maren stood outside the half-completed door opening, with the November wind moving through her coat, and looked at the 2 men and felt the cold that comes from clarity rather than temperature. 5 days. The inspection was scheduled for November 26th. She counted forward from that date to December 15th, which was when the serious cold was likely to establish itself for the winter, and she understood what 5 days meant in that calculation. If the inspector found against her, and he would find against her, if Hale had prepared him adequately, which Hale was clearly capable of, she would be under a vacate order for the coldest stretch of the year. She would lose the claim the way you lose something in a house fire, not through carelessness, but through the intervention of a force that does not distinguish between deserved and undeserved outcomes. Eli was inside the structure asleep. Ada was sitting on the stone pile near the door watching the 2 men with an expression Maren recognized as her own face when she was deciding whether a situation required a response or required watching first. Hale was watching Maren watch him, which meant he was trying to read whether she had the resources to fight this, and she understood that the reading was part of the strategy. He was gathering information about what she would do, the same way she was gathering information about what he intended. She looked at him for a moment without speaking, letting the silence do what silence does when it is held by someone who is not afraid of it. Then she said, "The inspection is welcome. Bring whoever needs to see it." Hale's expression did not change. He made a note in his small book. They rode away. That evening, Maren took Ruth's notebook from the canvas sack and sat with it by the fire for a long time. She was not from Carlton County. She had no standing in the community, no years of accumulated reciprocal obligation that would move men to speak on her behalf. But she had names, she had information, she had a picture of a network that existed and was capable of transmitting things goods labor knowledge, and she suspected words. The Calloway name was on several pages of the notebook in connection with families whose names appeared in Thompson, in context that suggested standing. Ruth had not given her the notebook carelessly. She had given it knowing what it was and what it could be used for, and the giving was a form of message as much as the content was. Maren wrote 3 letters that night by firelight, her handwriting smaller than usual because she was conserving paper. She wrote to families whose names appeared in the notebook in connection with the Thompson General Store and the church records and the County Road Committee on families with reach into the kinds of conversations that happened in places Maren had not yet earned access to. She described what Hale had done. She described it plainly without appeal to sympathy, in the tone of a person reporting facts that she trusted the reader to evaluate. She did not ask for intervention. She said only that she wanted people to know what was happening and on the St. Louis River claim in case the information was useful. Then she sealed the letters with candle wax and walked to Thompson the next morning and paid for the postage with money she could not spare. She went back to laying stone. The structure was complete on the 20th of November. 8 feet long, 5 feet wide at the base, 6 feet tall at the peak. The walls were solid slate, nearly 8 inches thick in the sections where she had doubled the layers, which was everywhere the wind came from. The door opening faced south, which meant the prevailing northwest wind hit the back of the structure rather than the entrance. The floor was lined with flat slabs. The fire pit was positioned where she had planned it, centered, bordered by the heaviest pieces she had reserved for this purpose, directly below the smoke gap. She had carried by account she had been keeping in her head, because she had no paper to spare for it, 907 stones from the riverbank to the ridge. The number had stopped feeling large around stone 600. After that, it was just the number, the same way the distance to Thompson had stopped feeling far after she had walked it often enough. She lit the first fire on the evening of November 21st. The children were behind her, Ada standing and Eli pressed against his sister's side, both of them watching the match touch the dry grass she had used as tinder. The flame caught. She fed it birch bark, then small sticks, then pieces of branch the diameter of her wrist. The smoke rose and hit the angled stone ceiling and spread laterally, and then found the gap at the apex and pulled through it in a thin column, exactly as the experiment with the dry grass had predicted it would. The draft was clean. The interior did not fill. She exhaled. What she had not predicted, what no test with a handful of grass could have predicted, because it required mass and time, was the heat that began to come back from the walls 40 minutes into the fire. Not the direct radiant heat of flame, which she had felt immediately. This was different. This was the walls themselves becoming warm, the dark slate absorbing what the fire was producing and beginning to return it in a slower frequency, the way a cast iron pan holds the heat of the burner, long after the burner has been turned off, but at lower intensity and for longer duration. She pressed her palm flat against the eastern wall and felt it clearly not hot, not uncomfortable, but warm in a way that had nothing to do with proximity to the flames. The stone was working. She let the fire burn for 2 hours and then let it die to coals. The children were already asleep, their blankets thrown off in the warmth that had built inside the structure, their faces slack with the specific piece of children who are finally at the right temperature after a long time of being wrong. Maren stayed awake and pressed her hand against the walls at intervals, tracking the warmth as the hours passed. 1 hour after the fire died, the walls were still clearly warm. 2 hours still warm. At 3 hours, there was a slight reduction. She could feel it, a degree or two of difference from the peak. but the warmth was there. At 5 hours, she pressed her hand flat against the stone and felt what she felt and sat down on the floor of the structure with her back against the wall and closed her eyes. The stone was warm against her spine, not warm like summer, warm like the difference between survival and its absence, which was she was learning. A much smaller difference than it sounded. Warren Hodge arrived on November 26 on schedule in a sleigh driven by Edmund Hale. Hodge was a narrow man with spectacles and a clipboard and the air of someone who understands that his function is to render judgments in situations he doesn't fully understand, which gave him a careful quality. He watched things before he spoke about them, which was a quality Maren respected even under the circumstances. Hale remained in the sleigh. Hodge climbed out and walked around the structure at once without speaking, pausing at the smoke gap to look at the thin column of vapor rising from it, pausing at the door opening to examine the chinking. His pencil moved over the clipboard. He did not look inside. Maren had been awake since 4 in the morning. She had built the fire at 5, burning it hot for 3 hours, and then letting it fall to coals an hour before Hodge was due to arrive. She had calculated this deliberately. Coals were evidence of a fire that had been running, not a fire currently burning, which meant the warmth in the walls at the time of inspection would be the wall's own stored heat rather than the direct product of active combustion. This distinction mattered for what she intended to demonstrate. She invited Hodge inside. He stepped through the door opening and stood in the interior, and she watched him become aware of the temperature. His pencil paused. He looked at the dead fire pit, clearly not burning, the coals gray and cold, and then at the walls. He reached out one gloved hand and touched the nearest surface. He did not speak for a moment. Then, "The fire has been out for—" She told him it had been out for more than an hour. He pressed his palm flat against the wall, the way she had taught herself to do, 3 fingers splayed, feeling for the depth of the warmth. He made a note. She said, "If you'd like to come back in 2 hours, I can show you the same reading." Hodge looked at her. He was not an unintelligent man, and he was not, she had decided, a corrupt one. He was a bureaucrat who needed evidence to write in a particular direction, and she was providing evidence. He said he would take the 2-hour reading now, if she was prepared to wait, and she said she was prepared, and so they stood outside in the November cold, while Hale sat in the sleigh and the temperature dropped, and the wind moved through the pine trees along the ridge, and nothing happened except time. 2 hours later, Hodge stepped back inside and pressed his hand to the wall, and the wall was still warm. He spent 4 minutes making notes. Then he stepped outside and said, without looking at Hale, "The complaint appears to be without merit. The structure shows adequate ventilation and sound construction principles. I will file accordingly." He climbed back into the sleigh. Hale's face performed a stillness that required effort. He did not look at Maren. The sleigh moved away down the track, and she stood watching it until the trees took it, and then she turned and went inside and sat by the cold fire pit and pressed both hands flat against the floor stones and felt the warmth that was still there, patient and slow and real. Burger Holm came back on the 3rd of December. He did not announce himself. She heard him on the path and looked up from where she was splitting the last sections of a downed elm she had dragged from the riverside, and he was standing there in a heavy coat with a look on his face that she could not immediately categorize. He watched her split wood for a moment. Then he said his wife wanted to know if Maren would come to dinner on Saturday. His wife had questions about the stone. She said yes. She met Ingrid Holm that Saturday and understood within the first 20 minutes why Birger had been sent to the river rather than coming on his own initiative. Ingrid was 40 perhaps, with the alert economy of a person who has learned to do everything efficiently because everything needs to be done, and there is only one of her. She had grown up in Vermont. She mentioned this once briefly in connection with a loom she had left behind when she married, and she had spent the journey to Minnesota becoming a person adapted to Minnesota in the way immigrants to hard places become adapted, which is by absorbing necessity until it becomes preference. She listened to Maren describe the construction of the Slate shelter and asked questions that were specific and practical in a way that Burger's questions had not been, because Burger's questions had been about whether it could work, and Ingrid's questions were about how it worked, which was a more useful category of inquiry. Ingrid said, "In Vermont, when I was a girl, there was a man who built what they called a heat wall. Not a fireplace, not a stove, a wall of stone set directly behind the firebox, thick enough that it took 4 hours to heat through, and 6 hours to cool down. The kitchen stayed warm all night from one evening fire. She looked at Maren steadily. What you built on the ridge is the same principle. Smaller under worse conditions with materials that chose you rather than you choosing them. But the same principle. Maren had not known that anyone else had done anything like this. She had thought she was making something new. The discovery that she was instead rediscovering something old, arriving at a truth that people had known and used and then somehow lost track of, did not diminish what she had done. If anything, it confirmed it. The truth had been available in the physics of stone all along. She had found it from the direction of desperation rather than knowledge, which turned out to lead to the same place. Ingrid said she wanted to build a heat wall inside their cabin behind the main stove. Not a shelter they had, a shelter, a solid frame structure that had served them through 7 Minnesota winters. But the cabin's weakness was the same weakness most frame cabins shared. It held warmth only as long as the fire burned, and the fire could not burn all night without someone to tend it, and tending a fire all night accumulated into a debt of sleep that eventually had to be paid. A slate wall behind the stove would absorb heat during the hours of active burning and release it slowly through the dark hours. Berger could sleep. The children could sleep. The house could maintain something above freezing without continuous fuel input. She wanted Maren to show her how to select the stone and lay the courses. Maren said she would come on Monday. She meant it as simple agreement. It was though she didn't know it yet the first class she would teach in Carlton County. The weeks between Ruth's departure on the 15th of December and the 28th when Warren Hodge would reappear passed in the rhythm of a life reduced to its operational minimum. Maren burned the fire twice a day, morning and evening, 3 hours each cycle. She had learned through the accumulated data of 40 nights observation that 3 hours of strong fire built enough thermal mass in the walls to hold the interior temperature 11 to 15 degrees above outside temperature through the intervening cold hours. 2 hours was not quite enough. The walls cooled into the single-digit margins by 4 in the morning, which was survivable but uncomfortable in ways that accumulated into danger when children were involved. 4 hours was wasteful at the rate her wood supply was depleting. 3 hours was the number. The days between the 20th and 27th of December brought temperatures down to 23 below zero and held them there with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. Maren rationed the fires to 2 hours per cycle and wore every item of clothing she owned to bed, and the walls held the temperature at approximately 10 degrees above outside, which meant the interior during the coldest night was 13 below zero. She could not let it get colder than that with the children present. She did not let it get colder than that. Each morning she rebuilt the fire and felt the walls respond and calibrated against the previous night's behavior. The stone was teaching her as much as she was managing. It had had its own logic of absorption and release that rewarded attention and punished impatience, and she gave it what it asked for. Eli's cough began on the 7th of January. It started as nothing remarkable, a tickle in his throat that resolved with warm water, and the honey scraped from the bottom of the last jar Ruth had included in the November sack. By the 9th, it had deepened into something Maren recognized from her years of classroom winters, the wet, settled quality of a cough that has moved from the throat into the chest that rattles when the child exhales if you put your ear close enough to hear it. His forehead was warm to the touch. He refused food. He wanted to sleep, and when he slept, the cough woke him every 20 minutes, and the expression on his face when he woke was not fear, but the dull exhaustion of a body allocating everything to a fight. It is not certain it is winning. She burned more wood. 6 hours that day, the fire running continuous from morning until afternoon, the walls climbing to temperatures she had not seen since the first experimental fire in November. The interior reached 55 degrees and held there, and Eli stopped shivering, and his breathing eased into something less labored, and she sat beside him and watched his chest rise and fall and counted the breaths and calculated. Her wood supply was at a quarter cord. At 6 hours of burning per day, she had perhaps 4 days of fuel. The weather on January 10th had turned the temperature climb to 20 above zero. The sun came out, the snow sparkled with the particular brilliance of cold that has momentarily softened. Eli's fever broke on the afternoon of the 11th. He sat up and asked for a story. She told him about the stone, about how it was made millions of years of fine sediment settling to the bottom of ancient seas, pressing under the weight of more sediment above it, slowly changing into something that was neither mud nor rock, but a new substance that had properties of both. She told him the stone in the walls of their shelter was old, beyond anything either of them could really hold in their minds, and that the heat it was holding right now had been put there by a fire they had built with wood from trees that had grown in the last 100 years, which meant the stone was doing something the wood could not do, translating the very recent into something that lasted longer. Eli considered this with the seriousness he brought to things that interested him, and then said, "So the rocks are helping us?" "Yes," Maren said. "They are." She pressed her palm against the nearest wall. It was warm. The wood supply was low, and the winter was not finished, and Edmund Hale had not shown his face in 3 weeks, which meant he was thinking, not abandoning. January was not done with them yet. But the rock was warm, and the children were alive, and she had learned enough about the relationship between stone and heat to know that what she had built could do things she had not fully understood when she built it. The morning of January 12th arrived without wind, the sky a hard, brilliant blue above the snow, the temperature a deceptive 20 above zero that felt almost reasonable after the weeks of cold that had preceded it. Maren was outside splitting the last of her wood when she heard Berger home on the path. He was not walking. He was running through knee-deep snow with his coat open despite the cold, his breath coming in torn clouds behind him, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen on him before. Not fear exactly, because fear implies uncertainty about what is coming, and what was on Berger Holmes' face was the expression of a man who knows exactly what is coming and is running because there is nothing else left to do. He pointed northwest without slowing down and shouted 4 words that carried across the snow, with the clarity of things said at the edge of breath: "Get inside, close everything." She looked northwest. The sky had changed while she was not watching it. The horizon that had been clear an hour ago was now a wall of darkness that was not clouds, not quite a density of weather that absorbed light, rather than diffusing it, moving toward them faster than weather should be able to move, and as though the ordinary rules about what was possible had been suspended for the duration of what was about to happen. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it against her face, the 20 above warmth of the morning vanishing in increments that were not gradual, being replaced by something with a different quality, entirely a cold that had intention in it. She dropped the axe. She went inside and pulled her children against her and began filling every gap in the walls with whatever she could reach. She had a quarter cord of wood left. She did not know if it would be enough. She did not know what enough would mean by the time this was finished. The darkness was moving toward her across the snow like a verdict, and for the first time since September, she let herself understand completely what she was facing, not as a problem to be solved, but as a force to be outlasted, which was a different kind of contest entirely, and one in which the only available strategy was to have already built what you needed before the moment arrived that required it. She had. She hoped it was enough. She began to burn. The storm hit at 2 in the afternoon, and the first thing it took was the light. Not gradually the way afternoon light fades in winter, pulling back from the edge of the sky and concentrating toward the horizon before giving up entirely. This was immediate. One moment, the snow outside the door opening was brilliant, and the next it was not there at all, replaced by a moving white mass so dense it had no interior, no depth, no distance. The wind arrived a half second after the darkness, and it was not wind, in any sense Maren had previously understood that word. It was pressure. It was the atmosphere reorganizing itself around a new set of priorities and not particularly concerned with what was in the way. The first gust struck the slate structure like something physical and deliberate, and the walls shuddered. Not swayed, not flexed, but shuddered, stone grinding against stone in a register she felt in her back teeth, and then steadied. And she understood in that moment that she was about to find out whether everything she believed about what she had built was true, or whether it was the kind of belief that only looks like knowledge until the thing it's supposed to explain actually happens. She had sealed the door opening with the canvas flap and every blanket she could tie into service, weighting the bottom edge with the heaviest stones she could lift one-handed, while keeping her other hand on Eli, who was still weak from the chest illness and had not yet found his full voice back. Ada was behind her, pressing flat stones against the base of the canvas with the methodical efficiency she brought to everything, not speaking, not asking questions, moving through the task as though she had planned for it. The fire was burning as hot as Maren could make it, the wood piled on, in quantities that would have seemed wasteful 24 hours earlier, and now seemed like the minimum that the situation would accept. She had a quarter cord left outside under the canvas tarp against the north wall. Getting to it meant opening the door into whatever was on the other side of it. She was not going to open the door. The temperature inside the structure had been 50 degrees when the storm hit. She had been burning since morning, building the walls up in preparation for the cold Berger had warned about. And the Slate had absorbed 6 hours of strong fire and was radiating it back into the small interior space with the slow generosity that had been its consistent behavior since November. 50 degrees felt extravagant, now felt like something she should have been more grateful for in the hours before the wall of darkness had arrived from the northwest. She pressed her palm against the eastern wall and felt the warmth there deep and steady. Not the surface heat of a fire-adjacent stone, but the thorough warmth of a material that has taken heat all the way through itself and is holding it evenly, the way thick bread holds the heat of the oven longer than thin bread does, the same principle operating at a different scale and with higher stakes. The wind found the gaps she had not known existed. Cold air came through the door seal in a thin blade that cut across the floor and pooled near the children's feet, and she stuffed it with stockings and then with the hem of her second dress, which she had been saving for some future occasion that now seemed irrelevant. Cold came through a joint near the base of the northern wall, where the mud chinking had frozen and contracted away from the stone, leaving a gap the width of a finger that produced when the wind hit it at the right angle. A sound like a sustained note on a pipe organ, a single frequency that her nervous system registered as warning before her conscious mind identified it as air. She plugged the gap with a strip of wool she tore from the blanket that was not yet committed to the door seal, working by feel, because the firelight was not reaching that corner reliably. The wood burned faster than she had ever seen wood burn. The fire was drawing hard from the draft at the apex, the same mechanism that had made the smoke gap function so cleanly throughout November and December, now working against her in its efficiency. The strong draw pulled heat up and out along with the smoke, and she had to keep adding fuel to maintain the temperature the walls needed to absorb. The quarter cord outside was not accessible. The wood inside the structure was what she had brought in that morning, 8 or 9 pieces enough under normal circumstances for 2 hours of moderate burning. Under these circumstances, it was going to last less than 1. When the last interior piece went on the fire, she did what she had to do. She opened the door. The wind hit her with a force that was not metaphorical. It knocked her back half a step physically, her boots sliding on the stone floor, and the canvas that had been sealing the door opening tore free from 2 of its anchor points and whipped inward and wrapped around her arm. The cold was not cold in the way cold had previously presented itself to her. It was a substance. It entered her lungs as something almost solid, and she coughed it back out and ducked low and moved through the doorway into the storm. She could not see the woodpile. She could not see the north wall of the structure she was standing against. She moved by memory 7 steps north, keeping one hand on the stone, and her hand found the canvas tarp, and she pulled it up and grabbed 2 pieces of wood with one hand, because 2 was all she could grip, and she turned back and moved the 7 steps south and through the door opening, and the wind sealed itself against the entrance behind her the moment she was inside. And Ada had the canvas flap up and pressed it back into position before Maren had straightened to full height. She did this 11 times. Each trip outside was shorter than the last because the snow had accumulated against the north wall, and the woodpile was becoming harder to reach, and each trip cost more than the one before it. In a way, she was tracking by sensation rather than measurement. The cost recorded in her hands, which had stopped feeling like hands and had become a general area of her body that was doing work she could no longer fully monitor. 11 trips yielded perhaps half a cord of wood brought inside in pieces of 2 or 3 stacked against the interior wall in a pile that she could see diminishing in real time as the fire consumed it. She calculated. She did not like what the calculation produced. She stopped calculating and fed the fire and pressed her back against the warm stone and pulled both children against her and waited. The temperature inside the structure dropped through the night as the wood supply fell. She watched it happen the way you watch something you cannot stop with complete attention and no effective agency. The the two combining into a state that is not quite despair and not quite acceptance, but occupies the narrow, terrible space between them. 45 degrees, 40, 35. The fire was burning, but it was burning smaller as the wood thinned and the walls were still giving back heat. But the rate of return was no longer keeping pace with what the cold was extracting through every imperfection in the construction. 30 degrees inside. The children's breath was visible. Eli had started coughing again, not the deep rattling cough of the previous week, but a shallow, frequent thing that seemed to be his body's response to cold air rather than illness, a protective mechanism that was itself exhausting. She burned the wooden box. It was the last item she had not yet committed to heat, the small, flat-sided box with a sliding lid that had been packed at the bottom of the canvas sack since Carbondale, which contained nothing except Walter's note folded in its original creases and a length of ribbon that had belonged to her mother. She had carried it across 3 states and through 4 months of survival, and she had not opened it since the night she arrived. She took it out now and held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of the wood and the smoothness of the lid, and then she handed it to Ada without explanation. Ada looked at it and looked at her mother's face and understood something from that face that Maren had not said in words, and Ada nodded once, not the quick nod of a child agreeing to something minor, but the slow, complete nod of a person who has been asked to participate in a real decision and is choosing yes. Maren put the box on the fire. It caught quickly, the dry wood flaring, and for a few minutes the interior was brighter and warmer than it had been in hours, and she thought, good, it does something. It was worth the burning. The last log went on to the fire at 9 o'clock in the evening. She knew it was the last because she had been counting backward from the first one she fed to the flames when the storm began, and the count had reached 0. She watched the fire accept it and begin the process of reducing it to coals, and she thought very clearly, this is the moment I will remember whichever way this ends. Not the building of the walls or the 11 trips into the wind or the months of carrying stone up from the river. This moment, watching the last piece of wood become fire and knowing nothing follows it. This is the weight-bearing joint of the whole structure, and I will know very soon whether what I built before this moment is enough to hold what comes after it. The fire burned for an hour and a quarter, and then it was coals, and the coals burned for another hour with a diminishing orange light that was beautiful in a way she had no use for, and then the coals went dark. The interior temperature was 22 degrees. The temperature outside, she learned later, was 45 below 0. The wind was doing things to the snow that she could hear through the walls. Not the usual sound of wind moving through structures, but a higher, stranger sound, almost vocal, as though the storm had an opinion about what it was encountering and was expressing it at a frequency designed to carry through stone. She pulled the children closer. Eli's coughing had slowed the warmth from the final hours of burning, had done something for his lungs, even as it depleted her resources. And in his stillness, now she could feel his breathing shallow but regular, the particular rhythm of a sick child who has found a sustainable pace and is holding it. Ada was awake. She had not slept since the storm began, and she was not going to sleep now, and Maren did not try to tell her to. Instead, she told her what she told Eli, in a different form, speaking quietly into her daughter's hair. The stone around them was older than anything either of them could imagine. It had been making and unmaking itself for longer than there had been anyone to understand what making and unmaking meant. Right now in this hour, what the stone was doing was giving back the heat it had been given slowly, in the way old things do things slowly because they have learned that slow is how you last. She pressed her hand against the wall. It was warm. Not warm the way a fire was warm. Not warm in any way that would have seemed significant under circumstances where significant warmth was available. But it was warmer than the air and warmer than the temperature outside by a margin that was, she realized, not narrowing at the rate she had feared it would. She pressed both palms flat and measured against her own body temperature, the most reliable thermometer she had. The stone was perhaps 15 degrees above the interior air. The interior air was perhaps 22 degrees, which meant the exterior wall surfaces were approaching 40 degrees, which meant the stone was doing what it had always done, releasing its stored heat into the space it enclosed, maintaining the differential with the patience of something that is not in a hurry because it does not experience time the way the people sheltering inside it do. The temperature inside the structure dropped to 20 degrees, and then to 18, and then it stopped dropping. She waited for it to continue. It did not continue. At 2 in the morning on January 13th, it was 18 degrees inside the stone shelter, while the storm outside drove the temperature to 45 below, and the wind loaded the snow against the exterior walls and drifts. She would not see until morning. And the walls absorbed that load and did not shift and did not crack and did not surrender the heat they had taken in 6 hours of burning in the way that August Strand had said with such certainty a woman alone could not build. She sat with her back against the warm stone and her children against her. And she did not pray exactly, but she was engaged in something that occupied the same space prayer occupies, a sustained attention directed at something larger than herself, a kind of listening that was also a form of gratitude that had not yet been told whether it had anything to be grateful for. The stone pressed warm against her spine. She listened to the storm. She counted her children's breaths. She waited. The storm ran for 3 days, 72 hours in which the wind did not fall below 40 miles per hour, and the temperature did not climb above 30 below zero, and the snow accumulated against the exterior walls until the lower courses were completely buried, which she would later understand had helped the packed snow acting as insulation against the exterior surface, reducing the rate at which the stored heat conducted outwards into the lethal air. She did not know this while it was happening. She only knew that the temperature inside the structure fluctuated between 15 and 22 degrees through the first night and settled across the second and third days into a pattern she could almost predict warmest in the hours closest to when the fire had been burning, coolest in the deepest part of each night, but never not once across the entire 72 hours dropping to a temperature at which a person could not survive. Eli's coughing eased on the second day. The cold was not good for his lungs, and she knew it was not good, but the cold inside the shelter was a different order of cold from the cold outside it, and his body seemed to understand the distinction in the way bodies understand things that the conscious mind is not yet articulate about. By the third day, he was asking questions again, which was how she measured his recovery. The return of questions indicated the return of energy available for purposes other than staying alive. He wanted to know what the wind sounded like to the stone. She told him she thought the stone probably didn't hear it the way he did. He considered this and said, "Maybe it feels it, though." She said that seemed possible. That seemed, in fact, like exactly the right way to think about it. Ada slept in the second and third days finally in pieces of 4 and 5 hours, her body claiming what it had deferred during the first 20 hours of the storm. She slept with the focused efficiency of someone who has understood that sleep is a resource and is managing her allocation of it. Maren slept in the same way intermittently, pressing her hand against the wall each time she woke to confirm the warmth was still there, the confirmation becoming a reflex rather than a conscious act. Not because she doubted it, but because the sensation of warmth under her palm was the most reliable thing she had experienced in 4 months, and there was comfort in touching it. On the morning of January 15th, the wind stopped. The silence was not like other silences. It had a quality of completion to it, the way a piece of music can end in a way that makes you aware suddenly of all the space that sound had been occupying. Maren was awake when it happened. She heard the wind die, not fade, not gradually diminish, but stop. The way something stops when a decision has been made, and she sat still for 30 seconds listening to the silence verify itself. Then she untied the canvas door seal and pushed it aside and stepped through the opening into a world that had been reorganized while she wasn't watching. The snow was at her waist, the sky was clear and brutally blue, and the sun was already above the ridge to the east, throwing long shadows off the drifts that had built up against every surface that had dared to interrupt the wind's passage. The temperature was 22 below zero. After 3 days of 45 below, 22 below, felt like information she could work with. She stood in the snow outside the door and looked at the structure she had built. And what she saw was this: it was standing exactly as she had left it. The walls had not shifted. The slate had not cracked. The mud and grass chinking she had pressed into the seams with numb fingers in November was intact. The snow had packed against it, but not through it, the exterior surface of the wall presenting to the wind and cold a face that had not yielded. She looked north toward Berger Holmes' farm 3 miles up the river valley and saw no smoke above the tree line, which was wrong. There should have been smoke. She looked east toward Thompson, which was invisible behind drifts that had built up taller than the ridge she was standing on. She was still looking when she heard movement on the southern path and turned and saw August Strand. He looked like a man who had walked out of something and was not certain yet whether the walking had been worth it. His face was gray with the particular pallor of skin that has been very cold for a very long time, and his hands when he pulled his mittens off were white at the fingertips, the first stage of damage that she recognized from a medical text she had read in the school library in Carbondale. Frostbite presenting as whiteness, before it presented as anything worse. He had walked 4 miles through waist-deep snow from his homestead near the Thompson Road, and he had walked because his horse was dead. His barn had collapsed on the second night of the storm, the weight of the accumulated snow finding the weakest point in the roof structure and making a decision about it that could not be appealed. Everything in the barn when the roof came down had died under it. She brought him inside. There was no fire, but the walls still held residual warmth from the burning 3 days ago, less than before the last traces of the stored heat, but enough to distinguish the interior from the air outside. Strand sat on the stone floor with his back against the wall that had faced the fire most directly, and he put his damaged hands between his knees and looked at the cold fire pit for a long time. He told her about the Henriksen family, a family of 9 husband-wife, 7 children in a frame cabin a mile to the west, the kind of solid timber frame construction that had sheltered Carleton County settlers for 2 decades, the kind of structure that August Strand and every other experienced homesteader in the county would have pointed to without hesitation as the appropriate shelter for a Minnesota winter. The storm had found a gap between the logs, a small one, the kind of gap that could be managed in a normal January. They had stuffed it with rags. The cold had come through the rags. By the second night, they were burning furniture. By the third night, they were burning sections of wall, actually removing boards from the structure's interior to feed the stove, dismantling their shelter to keep it warm, which was a logic that could only end one way. The 2 youngest Henriksen children, ages 2 and 4, had not survived the third night. Maren heard this and felt it land in her chest in a place that had no defenses. Left, all defenses having been spent on the practical work of the previous 72 hours. 2 children, dead in a cabin built with money and tools and the accumulated knowledge of experienced settlers who had done everything correctly according to everything they knew. She thought about Eli's breathing in the second night of the storm, the shallow, careful rhythm of a small body conserving itself. She thought about Ada's nod before the box went into the fire. She thought about how close the numbers had been and how different the calculation was when you built with thermal mass rather than against it, and how none of that knowledge was available to the Henriksen family because it had not yet moved from the ridge above the St. Louis River out into the county where it could do anything for anyone. Strand pressed his palm against the wall beside him. He held it there for a long time, feeling what was left of the warmth, the ghost of it almost gone, but present enough to measure. He said, "I told you that you would freeze." She said nothing. He said, "I was wrong. Not wrong about the cold, not wrong about timber, wrong about the stone." He looked at the walls around him, at the careful courses of dark slate, at the 8 inches of material that had held a 55-degree differential for 3 days without an active heat source. "I have spent 16 winters in this place," he said slowly, "and I have seen men who knew this cold far better than I will ever know it die in it. And you built something that held when everything I would have trusted failed." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I told you no one would help you. I was wrong about that too, but you didn't need the kind of help I was thinking of." He took his hand off of the wall. He looked at her with the directness of a man who has decided to say a difficult thing and is going to say it without softening. "You were right because you had no other choice. That is a kind of right that I cannot teach, and most people never learn because most people have other choices." He reached out and pressed his palm against the wall a second time, slowly, deliberately, the way you touch something to confirm it is real, rather than to assess its temperature. The stone held. "I didn't think it could. I was wrong." She had wanted to hear him say this. She had not known until this moment how much she had wanted it. Not the validation exactly because the children were alive and the walls were standing, and those facts did not require Strand's acknowledgement to be true. But there is something that the truth needs sometimes beyond being true. It needs to be witnessed by someone who started out believing the opposite and changed. Without that, even the most solid truth can feel provisional, can feel like something that happened once and might not happen again. Strand, sitting in her shelter with his frost-damaged hands and his changed mind, was the structure completing itself around the outside as surely as the slate had completed it around the inside. He told her before he left that Ingrid Holm had been asking after the shelter. Not out of curiosity, Ingrid was past curiosity into something more operational. She wanted to build the interior heat wall they had discussed, and she wanted to build it before the next cold system came through. And she wanted Maren to show her the stone selection and the laying technique, and she had already spoken to 2 other women in the county who had expressed interest in the same approach. Strand said this in a tone that was still adjusting to the new information about the world, still finding the register appropriate to the situation. But there was something in it that had not been in any of his previous tones when speaking to her, a quality of reporting rather than assessing. He was telling her something he had observed, not something he was judging. She said she would come to the home farm on Thursday. She had material to teach and stone that was free, and she understood in a way she could not have articulated in September, and could articulate very clearly now that knowledge kept in one place was knowledge that could only save the people in that place. She told him, "The stone is free. Anyone who needs to know, I'll show them." Ingrid Holm came on Thursday and brought with her a quality of attention that was itself a kind of building material. She had thought about the heat wall all winter, had been thinking about it since the dinner in early December, had sketched dimensions on the back of a flour sack, and revised them twice based on the volume of the firebox and the square footage of the room she was trying to temper. She wanted to understand not just the technique, but the principle, because the principle would let her adapt the technique to circumstances Maren couldn't predict. Maren told her everything she knew and some things she had worked out only while telling them. She showed her the angle of the lean that made the courses stable. She showed her the interstitial packing that locked the system together. She showed her by pressing 2 stones together and explaining what she was feeling. How to identify the stones that would lay flat from the ones that looked flat, but had a twist in them that would cause problems in the upper courses. Ingrid listened and built a test section and took it apart and built it again faster and with more confidence, the way someone learns who is not building up from nothing but connecting new information to a structure of related knowledge they already possess. She had the heat wall framed in her mind before she left that Thursday, and she had it built inside the home cabin by the end of January, the first of what would become 11 such installations across Carlton County before the following autumn. She was the person who took the technique from the ridge above the St. Louis River to the farms and homesteads of the county, not because Maren directed her to, but because Ingrid understood instinctively that a thing worth knowing was a thing worth distributing, and she had the relationships and the persistence to do the distributing. She taught women who had grown up on farms in Vermont, in Ohio, and Michigan, in Pennsylvania, women who had experience with stone from different contexts, cellar walls, wellheads, smokehouse foundations, and who recognized once it was named for them, the property of thermal mass, they had always been working around without working with. She taught them the fire schedule that built maximum heat into the wall, the sustained burn of 3 to 4 hours, rather than the shorter and more frequent fires that frame construction had trained them to make. She showed them how to read the wall by touch, rather than by measurement, because touch was always available, and measurement instruments were not. Each woman she taught adapted the technique to her own materials and her own structure, and in the adapting, the technique became richer and more varied than the single form Maren had invented on a Minnesota ridge out of necessity in Riverstone. Maren never charged for any of this. When people came to the claim to learn, and they came through February and into March, some of them having traveled significant distances after hearing from Ingrid or from someone Ingrid had told, she showed them what she knew and asked only that they pass it on to someone else who needed it. The principle seemed important to her, the passing on, not because she was being generous in any calculated way, but because she had arrived at the knowledge the way you arrive at something that the world gives you, rather than something you earn, and things the world gives you are not supposed to be hoarded. She had found slate in a river that was cutting through a geological formation that had nothing to do with her. She had found the principle of thermal mass in the behavior of a stone hearth in Vermont that she had watched at age 12 without knowing she was storing something useful. She had assembled these things under pressure and produced something that worked. The credit was widely distributed. The knowledge should be too. Edmund Hale did not return to the St. Louis River claim. The Northern Pacific Railway in the months following the blizzard found itself confronting financial difficulties more pressing than the speculative value of a single quarter section of public land. The storm had killed hundreds of prospective settlers across the territory and disrupted the expansion plans that had made adjacent land valuable in the first place. The letters Maren had written in November, routed through Ruth Calloway's network, had produced a small number of inquiries from the people connected to St. Paul newspapers, inquiries that Hale had been informed of through channels she never fully understood. The combination of financial strain and reputational risk made the Voss claim an asset whose pursuit cost more than it was worth. She received her final land patent in March of 1890 after completing the required 5 years of continuous residence. And the patent arrived in the mail at Thompson without ceremony or comment from anyone who had tried to prevent it. The winter of 1887 to 1888 killed at least 235 people across Minnesota, Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Montana. Some estimates place the number above 500. The dead included the 2 youngest Henriksen children and dozens of others in Carlton County, and across the region, farmers caught in open fields. When the temperature dropped 40 degrees, in 6 hours, children lost in the space between a schoolhouse and a front door, families who ran out of fuel and shelters that should have been adequate, and that everyone who built them had believed were adequate. The children's blizzard, as it came to be called, was a demonstration of the specific way that confidence in existing solutions becomes a liability when the conditions that those solutions were designed for change faster than the solutions can adapt. Warren Hodge returned to the claim in early February before the snow had begun to think about retreating. He came alone this time without Hale, and he walked around the structure and made notes and then asked Maren if he could go inside. She showed him what he asked to see. He pressed his hand against the wall in the way that everyone pressed their hand against the wall. She had stopped noticing this gesture from visitors and had started to understand it as a kind of instinctive verification. The hand doing what it always does when the mind is presented with something it needs to test before it can accept. The wall was warm. His report to the territorial government, filed in March of 1888, included a detailed technical description of the thermal mass principle, as he had observed it operating in the Slate shelter, the first such official documentation of the technique as applied to frontier construction. The report noted that the structure had maintained habitable temperatures through the most severe storm event recorded in Minnesota history without continuous fuel input, and recommended further study of stone construction methods for application in rural settlements. She stayed on the quarter section for 25 years. She watched Thompson grow from a scattering of houses along a railroad track into a real town with a school and 2 churches and a doctor's office that had a waiting room with chairs. She watched the birch trees along the river grow thicker. She watched Ada grow into a person who had her mother's precision and her father's capacity for attachment, a combination that served her well when she married a railroad engineer in 1897 and moved to St. Paul and raised 3 children in a house that had, at her insistence, a stone heat wall behind the kitchen stove. She watched Eli grow into a man who was patient with animals and methodical with equipment, and who had, in the manner of people who survive a formative ordeal in early childhood, a fundamental and undemonstrative confidence in his own ability to last through difficult things. Walter came back in the autumn of 1894. She heard his boots on the path from inside the frame house she had built in 1891. The Slate shelter had served as sleeping quarters through the construction period, and then as a storage structure for the dried goods that kept best in a space with stable temperature year-round. She heard the boots and knew them by their rhythm, which had not changed in 7 years, which told her something about how bodies carry their history, regardless of what the person carrying the body would prefer. She opened the door before he reached it. He was thinner than she remembered, and he had aged in the discontinuous way that men age when they have spent several years not taking care of themselves, jumping rather than accumulating. He was holding his hat in his hands. She looked at him for a moment, at the hat and the hands and the face that still had her children in it, the genetic debt that no amount of distance could settle. She said, "Eli's in the East Field." Ada married and moved to St. Paul. Come in, I'm making supper. He stepped through the door. She turned back to the stove. Neither of them said anything for a long time, and the silence that accumulated in the room between them was not the silence of things unspoken, but the silence of things already decided by her years ago in a way that required no announcement and no ceremony. Only the door open and the meal on, and the children's father given a place at the table he had not earned, but which she had determined in the privacy of her own accounting was appropriate to extend. He died in 1906, not dramatically of a winter illness that went to his lungs in the way that illnesses went to the lungs of men who had spent hard years outdoors in insufficient clothing. She mourned him with the specific grief of a person who loved someone and was also glad on complicated grounds. She had never tried to simplify that the loving had not defined the whole of what she had become. She had become, in the years between his leaving and his returning and his dying, something that did not have a clean name. A woman who had built a thing that kept people alive, who had taught what she knew to other people who taught it further, who had held a quarter section of land through legal harassment in 5 Minnesota winters in a blizzard that killed hundreds. She had done these things, and she had not stopped being the person she was before she did them, which was perhaps the part that mattered most and was hardest to explain. She moved into the frame house Eli built on the adjacent property in 1912 at age 58, at Eli's urging, and because the winters had begun to live in her joints in a way that made the Slate shelter's temperature variations harder to manage with equanimity. The Slate shelter stood through her move, and for 11 more years, used for storage and occasionally for the overnight sheltering of livestock that needed separation from the main barn. In 1923, when Eli needed the ridge space for a new equipment structure, he took it apart carefully, stone by stone, setting aside the pieces he wanted to keep. Beneath the foundation stone at the southeast corner, he found a small piece of paper folded inside a wrapping of hardened grease, the grease having done its job of keeping moisture out for 36 years. The paper was yellowed and the ink had bled slightly at the edges, but the writing was clear because his mother's handwriting had always been clear. Had always been the handwriting of a person who understood that words on a page needed to be legible to the person who would read them, which meant attending to them as you wrote rather than hoping they would be understood despite themselves. He read the paper and stood for a long time on the ridge above the river where she had carried 900 stones and built the thing that kept them alive. Then he folded the paper back along its original creases and carried it to the Carlton County Historical Society, along with 6 of the foundation stones, the darkest and heaviest ones, the stones that had been in contact with the most fire. The paper said 900 stones, 3 weeks, 2 children, $0. Enough. The Historical Society placed the stones in a display case in the main room and the paper in a protective frame beside them. The stones are cool to the touch in the climate-controlled building the way all stones are cool when they have not been given heat to hold. But there are winter nights when the temperature outside drops past 20 below, and the wind comes out of the northwest with the specific quality of wind that has crossed nothing but open country to get there, when visitors standing in front of the display case have said that the stone seems warmer than it should be, warmer than in the room, warmer than in the glass of the case, as though the stone remembers the fire, or as though the fire left something in the stone that the decades and the distance and the climate control have not quite managed to take back. Maren Voss died in 1919 in the influenza that moved through the country after the war, and she was buried in the Thompson Cemetery with a stone marker that gave her name and her dates and nothing else, because she had never been a person who required the stone to do more than the stone could do. She knew what stones were for. She knew what they could hold and for how long and at what cost. She had learned this the way she had learned everything that mattered to her, not from a book, not from a teacher, not from a man who knew more than she did, but from the long, cold, necessary practice of having no other choice and making that choice be enough.